What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video on the channel. Today, we're going to be redoing our 2023 first round overall picks. Before and after the draft, we went through and we had some tier lists about all the picks. Right after the draft, we went through and gave our initial kind of predictions and thoughts of how these players would pan out. So we're going to be looking at that. We're also going to be looking at how they are today and our ranking today, mostly based off of their rookie season, but some of these guys on here maybe didn't play as much, maybe were hurt for most of the season. So we'll get to see some guys a little bit of a projection too. Wouldn't be fair. One player that we'll talk about in a little bit, Christian Gonzalez, only played 4 games. So technically, if we're basing his rookie year, he would probably be a D or an F just because he didn't play, but he was hurt and he showed some promise. But we'll get through and go with those guys. First off, with the overall pick, the first overall pick in this year's draft, we have Bryce Young here, and we have A plus, A, B, C, D, and F, same tiers as before. And originally, we gave Bryce Young an A tier overall. Right now, I'm leaning more towards a C just because we saw what happened with CJ Stroud. They had the opportunity to pick CJ Stroud, and I think overall, he could be good. But in the end, as of right now, for ranking their rookie season, I think Bryce Young, I would have to give more towards a C just because we saw how good CJ Stroud could be.
Yeah, and I really liked Bryce Young going into this year. I still really like some of the things that Bryce Young does, but he ends the year 20th in passing yards, only 11 touchdowns to 10 picks. He doesn't have a very good QBR in pretty much any of his games this year. On my list, I had him in that D range, but I think C is more than fair. I still do think he's a great quarterback. He has intangibles, but he had absolutely nothing around him, and that is shown in his stat production. So I'll lean C. I'll go with you here, but I could see an argument for D, and if you really wanted to, maybe even F.
Yeah, I think once we get towards later in the tier list, he may even move down depending on how we see with these other players. Next up, CJ Stroud, the second overall pick in this year's draft. Originally, we gave it a B. I think this one's pretty obvious, an A plus pick here, having the best rookie quarterback season of all time, and has the opportunity to continue to lead this team going up against the Ravens this week. I've seen a lot of people say they're basically playing with house money right now without their wide receiver one who, in a sense, I wouldn't even really say he's a good receiver, and this receiving core is all right overall. But with what he has done this year, without even really having a coach, they don't know who the coach is really. I mean, before last season, there was no direction that this Texans team had. They've come in, and this team overall has been fantastic behind CJ Stroud.
Yeah, I think you put it really well. I mean, CJ Stroud, top 10 in the league in passing yards, 23 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He's had an incredible year. Even before this playoff run where we just saw him dominate against Joe Flacco and the Browns, he was already an A plus with a playoff win under his belt for a Texans team that, as you mentioned, you put it perfectly. They were really directionless, even going into this year's draft. It's got to be an A plus. He's looked absolutely incredible this year. And it's amazing because I don't even think we've come close to his full potential. He really is one of those guys that could be one of the best QBs in the league very soon. And there's a pretty good argument that he already is.
Yeah. And next up here, the Texans having a back-to-back pick here with Will Anderson. He's had kind of an underrated year. I think not a lot of people have been talking about how good he's been this year, but he's had a fantastic year on the edge, and I don't even think that he's reached his full potential too, especially like a guy like CJ Stroud. I think there's a lot left in his tank. I would be leaning towards an A here. I wouldn't say an A plus necessarily, but I think he definitely is in that upper tier of rookies this year.
Yeah, and we're on the same page again. I have him as an A. He's top 25 in QB pressures, and his run defense is even better. I mean, he's just a really good player. We knew it coming out of Alabama. He was a lot of guys' number one on their big board in general, and he deserved it. Has an incredible rookie year. I agree. It should be talked about more. He would be my unanimous defensive rookie of the year. So definitely an A tier for me as well.
Yeah, and next up we have Anthony Richardson here, who before going into this, we gave him I believe, a B overall ranking, and this one's a little tougher to navigate. Obviously, being injured for most of the year, he showed a lot of promise earlier in the season. With this one, it is a little tough. I'm kind of leaning towards the B or the C tier. I think if he played the full season, we would get a very good version of him, and I still think he does have potential. But I don't know if I necessarily could put him above a B, and I think kind of maybe towards a C tier would feel more comfortable for me for a guy that didn't get to play as much, but still has a lot of potential.
Yeah, and it could go either way for me. I am going to vouch him to be a B because when we did see him, he looked really good, and he looked good for the reasons outside of what I thought he was going to be at Florida. As some of you know, I'm super high on Anthony Richardson. I think he could be the best QB in this class, even with Stroud playing at this incredible level. He is really, really good, and his reads were on point in his short time in Indy to start this year. I think he was doing everything right except for sliding. If he slides and maintains his health going forward, I think he's going to be incredible. And I think he showed me enough in a short time that that would be the truth. I would say B tier. We could go C. I wouldn't be too mad, but I think he's better than average.
Yeah, I think right now I would say he could be a good C tier, and I would be fine moving Bryce down to a D.
Yeah, I think that's a fair move.
Next up with the fifth pick, Devon Witherspoon here. Going into this draft, I know a lot of people maybe had him as cornerback one. It seemed like before Christian Gonzalez was kind of that number one overall cornerback, but Devon Witherspoon jumped up a lot of boards. A lot of people, including both of us, a little bit surprised that they went with him there instead of a guy like Jalen Carter too. But Devon Witherspoon, we gave him a B before. I think he's played fantastic this year. I think he's in between that A and the A plus tier. I don't know exactly if I would give him an A plus because I think with the fifth overall pick, he's kind of played as well as that. He hasn't really I would say towards the later of the first round, maybe an A plus. But I think where he was drafted with his production, I would be comfortable with giving him an A just because he's exceeded the expectations a little bit, but it's not like he's the best cornerback in the league. I think he could definitely work his way up. He had a fantastic year overall too, but I still think there definitely is a lot of room for him to grow. But I could see an argument for A plus depending on where we get towards the end of this.
Yeah, and he's a guy that can move in between those tiers. I agree with A, and for a rookie cornerback, it's going to be really hard to give anyone an A plus. You know, it's a forgiveless position. Anytime you could get burnt once, it messes up your whole season of stats. And Devon Witherspoon was really on damage control. He didn't allow a lot of those opportunities, and I kind of see why he was the first corner off the board because his athleticism and his height makes it really easy for him to get a lot of pass breakups. Towards the end of the season, he was number one in pass breakups amongst all corners for a bit. He's a great player. I think an A is fair. And if it weren't for a couple of the speedier receivers he matched up with later down the year, getting some, easy yards on him, his stats would be incredible. But I think an A is fair for Witherspoon.
Yeah, next up here, we have Paris Johnson. This one I think will be very different from where we gave him before. Originally, we gave him an A overall. I think now I'm probably leaning towards maybe a D. He just hasn't really impressed me that much this season. Overall, for the Cardinals, they traded back up to get him. And I think he's one of those guys that we see tackles with this happen all the time in their rookie season. They don't really play fantastic, despite a few guys, we usually see tackles kind of struggle in their first year, then start to figure it out. It's definitely a big jump, but I would say I would lean more towards a D in this sense right now for Paris Johnson.
Yeah, I had him at a C or a D. I think when we see the rest of the tier list shake up, maybe we can go some sort of way about it. But when you look at his numbers, he allowed the most pressures on his entire team on a Cardinals offensive line that was really bad. So he was kind of the worst of the worst. He allowed tied for the most sacks out of any rookie tackle. And he just didn't look like himself until, again, towards the end of the year, you start to see him pick things up. I do think he is going to be really good. So, kind of for the same reason we would put Bryce Young in a C or a D tier. I kind of feel the same way about him. We did just bump Bryce Young down to the D tier. So with that being said, I think Paris Johnson is pretty comparable based on their rookie season. I like a lot of what he has. He's athletic, he's strong, just did not have a good year to go along with it. So I think D tier would be fair for Paris.
Yeah, next up here, this might be the biggest jump that we have in this whole entire draft right now. We had Tyree Wilson with an A earlier before, and now I would be leaning more towards that D to the F tier. He wasn't really going to play as much this year, but with what we know what happened with Chandler Jones, he got put into the starting lineup. And across from Max Crosby, you would expect him to get a high amount of pressures, a high amount of sacks, just because they usually double team a guy like Max Crosby, but he just did not perform at all this year. Arguably, maybe one of the worst overall or the bottom three in production from a rookie this season, comparable to some other guys we'll see on this list later. But I would say if we have to give someone the F tier as of right now, I feel like Tyree Wilson would have a good argument there. But with his potential too, I think he could easily get up to a D tier, but if we're basing it off of production in his rookie season,
Yeah, I'm gonna vouch for him for the D tier, to be honest, because F tier seems a little bit harsh. And based on maybe the first 10 games of the season, he would be in that F minus tier, right? He looked really, really bad, and his stats never really picked it up where he's comparable to some of these other great edge rushers. But in week 16, he goes against the Chiefs. He gets a lot of pressures on Mahomes. He has a good game against what's a pretty solid offensive line. And then week 18 against Denver, he shows what we kind of wanted to see all year. He's all over the place. He picks up a sack. He looked really good. So I'm going to say D tier. We saw bad pretty much all year, but towards the end, he's finally getting it together. And as you mentioned, with Max Crosby on the other side, I think it's going to give him free reign to bump those numbers up next year. I'll give him a D. It's not great, but I don't think he's an F, especially when we get deeper down this list and we see some guys that really did not do much this season.
yeah, next up we have Bijan Robinson here, a guy who pretty much played most of the season, some weeks a healthy scratch. He just didn't really get as much production as you would hope to see. And I don't think I would necessarily give him a D because when he was on the field, he was pretty good. He had some pretty good games to start the season. He just didn't really get on the field or get as many touches as we would hope. I kind of see him in the same range as maybe that C overall. I think he's probably an A plus potential kind of guy, but based on what we saw this year, hopefully he gets unlocked a little bit more next year. But he reminds me of a guy like Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson was hurt this year, so we didn't get to see him as much. Bijan had some opportunities. He just wasn't given the ball, but we know that's kind of how the Falcons have been the past few years, drafting these guys and just not using them at all. And I think Bijan could easily make his way up to an A or an A plus within the next few years. But for now, based on the production, I would just probably give him a C.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of in different area codes on this one here. I would have given him a B. We can discuss where we actually put him on the tier list because, yeah, he was disappointing, especially if you had him on your fantasy team. He wasn't finding the end zone a lot, but he almost got 1,000 yards on the ground. He almost got 500 through the air. And with the ball in his hands, he made so many elite level plays that we expected to see him with. I understand based on the rookie production, I could be talked into bumping him down to a C maybe, but he looks like the real deal when he's on the field. And when Arthur Smith kind of got the reins off the play calling towards the end of the season and Bijan's playbook was opened up a little bit, that's when we really saw him flourish. I really do think Bijan is going to end up being one of the better players in this class, at least at their peak. We know running backs don't last long. I think he's an incredible player. I think this year we saw flashes that encouraged me, but at the end of the day, his production's lower than we may have hoped for. He doesn't actually get 1,000 yards on the ground, which is something that a lot of us kind of already penciled in. So I'd be cool with C, but I do think Bijan's a great player.
Yeah, I think if we were going more towards the potential, I would definitely feel fine with a B. But for a guy that really only also getting into the end zone 4 times on the ground doesn't look great. I don't think, and it's really necessarily his fault. Like you said, he had some good times where he went out there and he made some big plays, but there are some other games against the Bucks, one rush, some games a healthy scratch. So obviously there was something going on. And I think if he can unlock that full potential, he could easily be towards that upper tier. But based off of his rookie season. And also, we have to account how high he was drafted to. If we're talking about a guy that was drafted in the top 10 as a rookie running back, you would kind of hope a little bit more. I would kind of lean more towards the C.
Okay, I can rock with that.
And next up here, we have Jalen Carter. We gave him an A plus before, just because both of us had him very high in our overall big board. I thought he was the best player in this draft overall, and he ends up getting picked with a 9th overall pick, and he has been fantastic. One of the best at his position in the NFL, not even just a rookie. I think he stays in this A plus tier personally. I think he's probably still the best player in this draft overall. I think you could argue for CJ Stroud just because he is a quarterback, but Jalen Carter is everything that you would expect him to be. And also taking into account that he was picked with the 9th pick here by the Eagles, I think he stays comfortably in that A plus tier.
Yeah, that's really interesting because Jalen Carter is another guy. He's been in the Defensive Rookie of the Year race the whole season. And looking back on it with the guys drafted ahead of him, I do think 9 is really good value. But is 9 really good value for a guy that can't be an every down sort of player? I think we're going to have to see that play out throughout his career. Obviously, Jalen Carter, he's only a rookie. He could develop into a guy that can be used every down. But when he's on the field, he's incredible. The defense for the Eagles had a lot of problems this year. He was far from one of them. He was arguably the best player on that whole whole unit. I think A plus is fine, but I also think this is a pick that's a little bit risky because if he's not a guy that you can start at nose tackle every single game, I don't know what his value is going forward. But based on the production we saw this season, he was fantastic, as you mentioned. I can roll with an A plus there as well.
Yeah, and like you said, arguably the best player in that group. I think he easily, the way that the Eagles kind of struggled this year, he was arguably the best player on that defense overall too. And also having a guy like Jordan Davis next to him, both of those guys may not be every down players, but when you being able to mix in both of them, I think they'll be able to get a good amount of production out of those guys. Next up here, Darnell Wright, the 10th overall pick for the Chicago Bears. He's a guy who is a little more interesting when you look at it. A guy that maybe wouldn't be too high, but I would kind of say, in my opinion, he's probably towards that middle tier, maybe like a C-ish. I don't know necessarily if I think he's a D. I think he performed better than Paris Johnson. I think you could argue B. It kind of just depends. I would say he's kind of the middle of the pack here.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the production he put up this year, obviously I'm a big Darnell Wright fan. He played at Tennessee, but for the Bears, he had a super similar season to Paris Johnson. But at the end of the day, he was picked a couple spots lower. He is a little bit better as a run blocker, and a lot of Darnell Wright, excuse me, a lot of his bad games were up against when they played the Raiders and Max Crosby, the Lions and Aiden Hutchinson, the Packers and Rashawn Gary. I mean, like he dominated against guys that were on his level, but he kind of got cooked by these higher echelon guys, which is what you expect from a rookie playing on the right side. I mean, it's a little bit tough. I'd give him a C. I think he beat the guys he was supposed to. He got cooked by the guys that were supposed to beat him off the line. So I think Darnell Wright had an all right year. I think he projects as a better player, but just, average this year. I think C is fair.
Yeah. Next up, Peter Skoronski here from the Titans. And I think besides the injuries this year, he played pretty solid overall. And personally, I would probably give him the first B overall. I think he's played better than Darnell Wright, and Darnell Wright playing better than Paris Johnson. So I think he would probably be the first one in my B tier as of right now. If he can stay healthy, move forward, and have a full healthy season the next few years, I think he could easily develop into one of the best guards going into this season. We both talked about it, that he would be a very versatile player for this Tennessee offense. And so far this season, he was great overall in the guard role. And I think he could be a great addition for this offense.
Yeah, I think you put it perfect. Skoronski's penciled in on B on my list as well. I totally agree. Only allowed 4 sacks all year, and I think you hit the nail on the head. He came in as a guy that we touted as being very versatile. I think he showed that. And with the Titans O line being pretty bad, it's really nice to have a young guy like him who you know is going to be solid and you can put pretty much anywhere on it when you head into free agency and future drafts. I think Skoronski's great. I think B is totally fair, and he's another guy that I think will only continue to progress and be better at the actual fundamentals of pass and run blocking as he gets a little bit older.
Yeah, next up here we have Jahmyr Gibbs, who originally we gave a D tier ranking towards, but this season he played fantastic as a running back number 2, had pretty comparable numbers to a guy like Bijan, which we gave a C tier earlier. He got drafted later. I know a lot of people weren't huge fans of this getting drafted within the top 15, but having almost 1,000 yards on the ground and 10 rushing touchdowns as a rookie is fantastic. I would be leaning towards that B or A tier just because he got drafted after Bijan, and doing this as a backup rookie running back, 10 touchdowns on the ground is fantastic. So I kind of want to hear where your opinion is, because I know not a huge fan of this pick going into this year.
Yeah, and I wasn't. I did not see the flash that Gibbs had in college, but I think I've totally seen it in the NFL. I mean, we're all watching the same games here. Jahmyr Gibbs as the change of pace back with David Montgomery in the backfield. He's one of the more explosive backs in the entire league. He's great in the receiving game. And between A and B is really hard for me as well. I had Bijan in the B tier and my list, so that put Jahmyr Gibbs in the A tier for me. I'll let you make the final call on that, but as we saw more and more into the season, the Lions got more games under their belt. Jahmyr Gibbs just played better and better. I think he had a really strong end to his season, but if you could argue the B tier, I think it would be because you draft a running back at 12. And based on a lot of the mocks that we saw going around, Jahmyr could have been at least in the late 20s, early 30s. So it's tough. Again, you get the final call on this, but I think Jahmyr Gibbs is also in that A or B range.
Yeah, and I think what we're looking at too, like we said, drafted with a 12th overall pick. If we're looking at these next few guys up on the tier list, I think he easily makes his way up into the A tier. Just looking at everyone coming after him, there's some good guys, but when we're looking at the rest of this first round, I don't really think that there were too many guys that the Lions could have got that would have put up as much production as Gibbs.
Yeah, fair enough there.
And next up, Lucas Van Ness, another guy towards the middle of the pack here for the Packers. Funny enough, he was pretty good this year, had some flashes sometimes. Some other times, he just didn't really play as many snaps. I would kind of give him maybe that C tier. I don't necessarily think he's a D tier just because he didn't play as much, but when he did play, he went out, he got some good pressures. And overall, kind of the middle of the pack, there's a lot of edge rushers in this class. Out of the rookie edge rushers, ranking 6 out of 15th overall from a grade. So I think that puts him towards that C tier. And I know there's a lot of people that are a big fan of him. He had a pretty decent rookie season. So I think you could even give an argument towards the B, but I would probably lean more towards the C for now.
Yeah, I'd give him a C tier personally. He did have a really good rookie year when you just look at the stats, but that was really inflated by a really good week 1 where he showed flashes of why he was taking up this pick. I mean, for 1 week, he was the best rookie in this class, but as the year started to get more into it, he started slowing down a little bit. He made a lot of efforts on special teams as well. I know he's on that unit and he's been playing pretty good. So Van Ness is a C. I don't think he did anything wrong to make him a D or an F, but I also don't think he showed off anything that gets me super excited about his production. So I think right in the middle is where I'd have him.
Yeah, and then next up here, we have Broderick Jones from Pittsburgh. I think he probably towards that middle of the pack too. I would say you could argue that maybe he's towards that C, maybe even the B tier. I know he had some flashes this year out of the offensive tackles towards that upper class, which we've seen maybe more comparable to a guy like Skoronski than Darnell Wright. But I think in between that B and the C tier.
Yeah, and I'm gonna vouch for the B. I do think he's closer to a guy like Skoronski based on this season. And when he was at left tackle, which was his natural position at Georgia, I know he really didn't look that great. And then Pittsburgh made the decision to move him over to right, and he was kind of shut down the whole year. Not a lot of guys were getting stuff by him. I also think he showed his athleticism this year, which was probably one of his most highly touted features as a prospect. I do think Broderick Jones had a really solid season, and kind of similar to the Titans, the Pittsburgh Steelers have things to figure out on that O line. I think Broderick Jones being versatile, jumping from the left to the right side, kind of adds a little bit more to his game. I would have put him in the B tier.
Yeah, next up here, Will McDonald for the Jets. Neither one of us too big of fans of him at this pick overall with a 15th overall pick. We both gave him a D in our initial tier list, and I think you could easily make an argument that he would be even lower, maybe even put him in the F tier as of right now. I mean, looking at the season, only 9 total tackles. He had 3 sacks, which is okay for a rookie, but getting picked with a 15th overall pick, he's already 24. I don't really know what the plans are with the Jets for him in the future. There was a lot better guys that we can look at even outside of the first round after this. With the way that the Jets went this season, they could have drafted almost anyone after this spot, and I think they would have given him more production. I think Will McDonald could make the argument for the first F tier.
Yeah, I think McDonald was taken with the assumption that you wouldn't have some of the guys brought back that you did. So it was kind of a head scratcher at the time. He is 24 years old, as you mentioned, which isn't great. When he was on the field, I mean, you could scout PFF grades, you can look at the snaps. Like, he is a good player, just not for the Jets and not at 15. So for those reasons, I think F tier is fair. I think D is also in the conversation. He did not have a tremendous year, mostly because he didn't get the snaps. If the Jets just say, hey, we're going to strip things back, we're going to let Will McDonald start, I have no doubts he'll be a good player, but we haven't been able to see that this year. So he's definitely a lower tier guy.
Yeah, next up, Emmanuel Forbes here with the 16th overall pick. I personally think right now, probably towards a D tier. He just was kind of bullied a lot this season. He did show some flashes in some weeks. I don't think he's necessarily an F. I don't think he is towards that bust potential already, but just not great. Also, looking at who was drafted right after him, Christian Gonzalez, who is a better player. Even Deonte Banks later in this draft was drafted, and I think Emmanuel Forbes, probably the worst rookie cornerback, not to spoil anything, but the worst rookie cornerback in the first round of this class.
Yeah, he's an F to me. There's like five corners after this that were all much better. Emmanuel Forbes spent this whole season being cooked. I mean, I respect the Commanders for putting him up against some of the best receivers in the league, mostly because they don't have any other corners. But he allowed 205 yards to AJ Brown at the start of the season. He ended the season with letting Brandon Cooks get 7 catches on him. He was, I mean, coming into the draft, he was tall, but he was slow. He wasn't really like a guy that can match foot speed. And AJ Brown is fast, but he's not like a burner or anything. And he just got cooked over the top over and over again. I hate to keep going back on one game, especially against a really good receiver, but it's not like he did much against some of the worst receivers he matched up against. He can't really shadow a guy. When the Commanders run zone, he doesn't even really look comfortable in it, which is strange because I know he did in Mississippi State. I'm not a big fan of Forbes. I think he can recover, but I think this was a horrible rookie season. So I would say F for him.
Yeah, we can put him in the F tier. Fine with that. Next up, Christian Gonzalez. I think he has a lot of potential. I think based on what we've talked about so far, I would feel pretty comfortable putting him in the C tier next to Anthony Richardson. I think we can both agree that both of those guys, if healthy, if playing a full season, showed potential to be an A or an A plus, but not playing as much this year. I don't know if we can necessarily put him above that, just because we also have to realize players coming back from injury, we usually just think that they're going to come back and be completely fine, but we never really know in the end. Obviously, we hope that all the players can come back and play to their full potential, but in the end, we never really know what's going to happen when players come back from an injury. So for now, I think he's a C tier, but his potential easily an A plus and can completely by the end of next year be one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL, and I would not be surprised.
Yeah, and really tough for me because I'm a huge fan of his. I would have loved to be able to give him an A plus right now because I think he is that type of player. But I think you nailed the analysis there. He is injured. It was a serious injury. Who knows if he's going to come back at the same speed? You know, it's a tough break. He's an amazing player. I have faith that he will come back and be one of the league's best corners soon. But we didn't get to see that on the field this year. I would have loved to. We saw it the first couple weeks. He was great, but like Anthony Richardson, didn't get to play. I think you hit it on the nose. He's probably in that C tier.
Yeah, next up, Jack Campbell here, who we gave an F tier in our initial rankings. This one's kind of tough. I think D or F still. I would probably lean more towards an F just based on the players that we see after him. And he's a guy that I think could have been drafted in like the third or the fourth round. I still don't really love the pick here. When we're comparing him to a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs, what we said before is when these guys got drafted, obviously when we're looking at these mock drafts, we didn't give them high ratings, but after, if they show production like Jahmyr Gibbs with an A pick in years, if he continues this and we look back and he's the 12th pick, we can say, oh, okay, maybe he was one of the best players in the draft. The mock drafts don't matter. But Jack Campbell with the 18th pick, I still can't get behind it. He show anything this year in that coverage as a linebacker. Just taking a linebacker in the first round, honestly, just a pure linebacker, which we saw with Jack Campbell. I just don't think he's really that great. I would lean towards the F.
Yeah, it's really tough for me because based on the production, he deserves better than an F. He is a good player, but based on the selection and all the semantics around it, he is definitely an F. It's really tough because he came into the season and he was the guy, he was supposed to be their head honcho. And then you see guys like Barnes kind of dig into his snaps, and it's tough because the Lions have a good defense and Chris Barnes is a good player. So it's kind of a tough break for Campbell. And he really didn't have a game this year where you went, wow, until really late in the season when he's taking on the Vikings who have Jaron Hall and Ty Chandler, right? Pretty much any rotational rookie running back would have a good game against those guys. So with that being said, it's an F, but I'm a huge middle linebacker fan. I do think middle linebackers deserve to be drafted in the first round. I don't think we're past that now. It's just tough to have that take when Jack Campbell doesn't play up to the standard I expected him to. F is fair, but again, that's a player I really like.
Yeah, and next up here we have Kalijah Cansey. He did miss a few games this season overall, about 5 or 6 games this year. He just didn't get to play in, but when he played, he did show some flashes. I would lean more towards the D tier just because I still think that he does have a good amount of potential, and I was a big fan of him going into this year. He's still young, so comparing him to a guy like Will McDonald, they have similar-ish production. I think Cansey just performed a little bit better throughout the season, more sacks, almost triple the amount of total tackles, and he's still two years younger than him. And I think in this Bucks defense, he could still continue to play better. So I wouldn't give him an F. I would lean more towards the D.
I would actually argue Kalijah to be in a C. I think it's closer to a B C thing, only because the production is similar to a guy like McDonald. I agree. But Kalijah Cansey as a rookie, I know he missed some games, but he's like one of the best run defenders on the interior, like in the whole league. And I know that's a huge stretch. He's probably not even the best in this first round. We already talked about Jalen Carter, but he's really, really good. Next to Vita Vea, I think it's a pairing that's going to bode well for the future. The only reason he wouldn't be in that B tier for me, I'm pretty confident on C because maybe the Bucks didn't need him. Maybe they had some more pressing needs, but obviously we saw them go in and dominate against Philly. I mean, they're a really good team, and I think Kalijah Cansey is actually a pretty big part of it. I don't think that he is necessarily a world changer. I don't think he has the potential to go out and, we look back and call him a top 5 guy in this class, but I think he was worth his selection at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be completely fine putting him in that C tier as well. Next up, Jackson Smith and Jigba. He's had an interesting year, showed some flashes, but he's also on a team where he was the third receiver this year. I mean, looking at the rest of the guys here, he started off a string of 4 wide receivers going in a row, and all 4 of these guys kind of had a different up and down season at the wide receiver position. I wouldn't necessarily give him a bad ranking. I would lean more towards the C because I think there was better options. But in the end, if I look at these other receivers on the list, with guys like Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, I just don't think there was as much room for Jackson Smith and Jigba to play. I mean, if you throw a guy like Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison, who I would argue probably better receivers to this point, I don't think that's a hot take, but how much production would they really get as a third receiver on this team? I would lean more towards the C because I do think he has a good amount of potential. He just didn't really get to show it too much this year.
Yeah, and I don't want to spoil these future receiver rankings. Obviously, you mentioned we got 4 in a row. I think Zay Flowers probably was the only other like better option for the Seahawks this year. I think JSN fits what they want to do from a guy in the slot, and as you mentioned, third receiver. I didn't get in the end zone a whole lot, but 628 yards is good for a slot receiver rookie. Gino and him, it took a minute to get a connection. He had a pretty good game when Drew Lock was playing, if I remember correctly. I think JSN's a good player. He's probably in that C tier for me as well. I expect big things from him, but just the situation he's in right now, it doesn't really bode well for him to, put up top 10 receiving numbers anytime soon.
Yeah. Next up here, Quentin Johnston. This is a spot where looking at the next 2 wide receivers, I think either one of those guys could have fit in this offense a lot better. Just not really understanding the pick when they took him overall. When we're looking at this Chargers offense, they pretty much just have the 3 same exact guys at receiver. I think he could be a decent guy in the future. But for now, with the 2 guys after him, I would lean towards the D. I think there could be arguments for an F, but I don't think he's close to that C tier at all. He's not close to Jackson Smith and Jigba. I know they had similar overall production, but I just think both of the guys drafted after him, Quentin Johnston maybe had a quieter year than Jackson Smith and Jigba, but the way that the Chargers just have so many injuries on the offense, watching Quentin Johnston too, I mean, he just had a lot of opportunities this year that he could have easily taken advantage of, and it just seemed like he really didn't in the end. I would lean more towards the D.
Yeah, and this season proved that the Chargers actually have 4 of the same receivers because we see Mike Williams get hurt and Josh Palmer comes in and does the exact same things. It's just weird team building at the end of the day. Quentin Johnston, like I was a huge fan of his at TCU. I was really excited for him to get drafted, but at the end of the day, he was a guy you take because you want to be competitive, and he's a wide receiver that's like a ready day one sort of guy, and that's just not what we saw at all. I mean, he is a big guy, he's a deep threat, and to reach that full potential, he has to go out and, high point some footballs. Instead, the hypothetical Chargers that were like supposed to be good with Justin Herbert throwing good passes, they don't matter because Quentin Johnson is dropping all of them. I honestly have him in that F tier. He's pretty much just wide receiver Emmanuel Forbes for me. D is an argument because, I'm a fan of him. I think he can be good, but this year was brutal for Johnston. And when Mike Williams comes back with a fully healthy season, and with Palmer honestly being a better receiver, I don't even know how Quentin Johnston gets on the field.
Yeah, I feel pretty comfortable putting him in that spot too. Next up, Zay Flowers here, who I originally had as an A pick, one of my favorite players in this class. I would still have him in that A tier. I wouldn't say A plus just because he didn't have as much production. You know, there was some times where he had the ball, he just didn't make the right reads, maybe dropped a few passes, but still a fantastic rookie season. And production wise, I think being able to run the ball and being able to catch the ball in the backfield as a receiver. He had a great year too for this Ravens team. And it seems like he's already Lamar's favorite target on the offense. He's looking for him on almost every play, whether he throws it to him or not. You can just tell that these guys already have a great connection. And I think he could easily end up as the best wide receiver in this class. I know there's a lot of good guys later in this class who we're not going to be able to talk about. Puka Nacua obviously having a great season too, but is probably the most dynamic and just overall best player to watch in this draft, in my opinion. One of my favorite players from this class, and I think he's lived up to his potential this year.
Yeah, Zay is awesome. If you take like his five best games and put him against a lot of the other great receivers in football, his are better. It's just he's a young guy. You know, he had to build that connection with Lamar, and he kind of benefited from Mark Andrews' injury. Obviously, that didn't help the Ravens team, but got him a lot more looks. Zay Flowers was a guy we both really liked, obviously coming out of Boston College, somewhat close to home. Shout out New England. But Zay Flowers, he's an incredible player. That connection with Lamar is something I expect only to grow. I'm with you. I would love to put him A plus because I think he's that type of player, but we got to be fair and based on the production, he's more in that A range.
Yeah, next up, another guy here, another wide receiver. Just if you're the Chargers watching this, looking at all these receivers, pretty much anyone else you drafted, you could have even taken Puka Nacua in the first round, and many would have probably said, "Oh, well, that's a terrible pick," but probably would have worked out better in the end than Quentin Johnston. But Jordan Addison, I think he's also kind of on the edge of that A plus. I think he has an argument for that A plus just because he put up a lot of good production this year, had a lot of good receptions, had got in the end zone a good amount with Justin Jefferson out. He took a step up, so I would lean more towards the A tier. I think he was a little bit better than Zay Flowers production wise this year. But I think when we're looking towards the future with Justin Jefferson there, his production may come down a little bit. I know they both played and they had some good production together, but when Justin Jefferson was out, Jordan Addison had some big games too. I do think there is an argument for A plus, so I want to hear what you say, but I think he would be that very high A tier.
Yeah, I'm more on the very high A tier as well, just because obviously Addison and Flowers back to back. I think they're both like just as good as each other. They both do different things. And with Addison, he had a connection with Kirk early, and they love to throw the ball downfield. I mean, we saw Adam Thielen year after year, no matter who was the number one receiver, whether it was Diggs or Jefferson the last couple of years, he would put up monster numbers, and he was a great receiver. And it's just because he got great looks. I can see Addison doing a very similar thing. Zay Flowers, he's more versatile, and if you give him the ball in the intermediate zone, he's a guy that could break it off for an 80-yard touchdown. Jordan Addison's more of a guy that will just burn you over the top. He doesn't need the yak yards, so I would put him in that A tier as well. His numbers were better than Zay, so if someone's watching this video and they think he's an A plus, just comparing stats, completely fair. But I think he's just as good, so I'd say A.
Yeah, next up here, Deontay Banks. I think this year he had a very interesting season as a rookie. Being on the Giants, he was kind of forced into that cornerback one role. He went against pretty much every single team's number one receiver all year, and he had a tough stretch. But then towards the end of the season, the last 5 games, he didn't allow more than 40 yards per game. So there were times where he was looking like one of the best cornerbacks in this class. He had very good coverage stats, but then there were some weeks that he was getting burnt as a rookie cornerback. So I don't think necessarily he's towards the bottom. That may be me being a little bit biased, but I do think that he will have a good future for this team. I think there's still a lot for him to learn, but he's a very aggressive guy. We knew that going into the season. Looking at his profile, he's a guy that likes to gamble. I mean, if you throw the ball towards him, and he got targeted a lot this year. He got targeted as much as a guy like Emmanuel Forbes. Both of them kind of bullied throughout the season, but Deontay Banks made some plays in the end, and he's an aggressive guy. He's going to go out there. Sometimes he does get flags, but sometimes he goes out there and he does get the interception or the breakup of the pass. So I'll let you give this first grade out, but I wouldn't think that he's necessarily comparable to a guy like Emmanuel Forbes just because he also was drafted later. And I think he does have a pretty good upside.
I think you're really gonna like my answer. I'm actually pretty high on Deontay Banks. I'm not stupid. Deontay Banks got targeted like in the exact same situations as Emmanuel Forbes, and he actually went out and made plays. The flags are concerning. That's kind of what drags me down from like being really high on this guy. But if you go game by game, you look at his coverage stats, he only got beat up by Devontae Adams and AJ Brown. So AJ Brown loves beating up the NFC East rookie corners. That's his favorite thing to do. And Devontae Adams, still one of the best targets in football. And to be honest, you look at his actual numbers he's putting up, and he's like top 15 in coverage stats this year. That gets taken down when you get burned over the top, obviously, when you have flags. But I had Deontay Banks like in a B, C range. So I'm not even flirting with an F or a D. I think C is probably fair, but I really liked a lot of what Deontay Banks showed me, especially as you mentioned towards the end of the year.
Yeah, my initial ranking was a C. I think he's up there too. I think he has a lot of good potential for the future, but for now, I think he is kind of comparable to a guy like Jackson Smith and Jigba, obviously playing opposite sides of the ball. But both of these guys could definitely improve a lot in the future. But rookie season, maybe not as much to look at, but going into it, the next few years, I think they could both develop very well. With a lot of these guys on this tier list too, in this spot. Anthony Richardson and Gonzalez both hurt this year. Bijan, a guy who can easily develop into one of the best players, just didn't get as many chances. I think Deontay Banks, if he starts to figure out how to play more aggressive without drawing the flags, which I also think will come with just being an older player. Rookies, a lot of the time, they will get flagged. A lot of the older guys, they may play as aggressive as the younger guys. They just don't get as many flags. Next up here, Dalton Kincaid. He got drafted by the Bills here. An interesting pick just because it seemed like they didn't necessarily need a tight end, but he went out, he produced for them this year, especially in that last playoff game, which we saw. I don't know exactly where I would put him. I would say maybe towards a B tier just because we saw Sam Laporta get drafted later in the draft and produced a lot better. So maybe towards a C, but production wise, as a rookie tight end, he did play very well. Also, considering that he was arguably the backup going into this year, too.
Yeah, and I would give him a B. Obviously, in hindsight, it's tough with Laporta being so great, but I do think they're similar, types of players. I think Kincaid is not that much worse than Laporta. And coming in, as you mentioned, it was kind of Dox and Knox or had been, a pretty solid tight end. And Kincaid took his job and more than that. I mean, he had some slower games, but he finished the season really strong. And as a receiving threat, he's really talented. And that's something that people were kind of 50-50 about. People were like, all right, he's a better blocker than Laporta, but how are his hands when he actually gets to the NFL? He's not dropping a lot of passes. Him and Josh Allen built out a pretty good connection, and he is one of the go-to guys on a playoff team as a rookie. I'll give him the credit where it's due. I think he's a B. I could see an argument for C, though, when you look later in the draft and realize there was some other tight end talent.
Yeah, I agree with that right there. Next up, we have Maisie Smith for the Cowboys. I would lean. This one's a little bit tougher just because he is on a defense that, is very hard for him to be able to get in there and get some snaps. And he only ended up with 1 sack this season. I do think he has some potential. It is just going to be tough because, as we know, Dallas has one of the best defenses overall. I would lean more towards the D, but I could easily see with the arguments putting him with a guy like pretty much anyone in this F tier so far that maybe they could produce later, but their rookie season wasn't good. But I do think that Maisie Smith could be good, but I could easily see that F tier argument.
Yeah, and I kind of prefer D on this because unlike some of the guys in the F tier, he didn't go out and make bad plays. When he was on the field, he was all right. But I mean, the Cowboys have said it themselves. They said it while the season was still going on before this playoff loss. He's going to need to drop weight. He's a big guy, and you want a big guy in the center of your defense, but he needs it to muscle. I have no doubt that he's going to do it. He just needs to play kind of a different role than we expected him to when he got drafted. So it doesn't seem like the Cowboys made the best pick. I think there were other guys that could have affected their team, like, today. They could have actually went out and beat the Packers, but they didn't end up taking a guy like that. They take a project at the end of the first round. It's not going great, but he's not horrible. I think D is fair.
Yeah. Next up here, Anton Harrison for Jacksonville. I would lean more towards a D here. I don't think he's an F. I think he did play decent this season. I wouldn't say he's a C just because I think the guys above him are a lot better, especially at that tackle spot. I wouldn't say he's a Darnell Wright, but I would probably lean more towards the D there. I feel like with the spot that he was drafted to, that may give him a little bit more leverage just compared to the rest of the guys on this list getting drafted a lot higher at the tackle spot. I think he could be a little bit better, but in the end, he did have a so-so season as a rookie.
Yeah, and man, I feel a little bit differently than you on this one. I mean, you look at the numbers and pass blocking, Anton Harrison is probably the best tackle so far in this class. I understand putting him a little lower. I don't think he has that top end potential. Like, I mean, it was shown in his draft stock, right? Everyone knew he was good at Oklahoma, but where does he max out? How high is his ceiling? Probably not as high as a guy like Darnell Wright or even Peter Skoronski, who's more on the inside. But Anton Harrison was a really good pass blocker. I think at 27, he was really good value in that spot. And yeah, he's going to need to work on the run game. I think the Jaguars in general, they didn't run a whole lot of outside zone that resulted in many big chunk plays. It's not something they do very well in the first place, but at 27, you pick a guy who may have had the most talented rookie season out of any of these exterior linemen. Like, I had him at a B. I think C could be argued because we got to talk about the potential, but I do like Anton Harrison quite a bit.
Yeah, I think he could fall into that C spot. Halfway through the season, he just didn't look as good, but I think he definitely did kind of pick it up towards the end of the season. Myles Murphy, the next guy here for the Bengals, starting off the last four picks. Overall, his season just wasn't as good as you would hope, but he was one of those guys that was drafted towards the end of the first round, as we'll see with the next guy. And both of these guys just overall at that position, I don't want to give anything away for these last few picks, but that edge position towards the end of this first round, maybe not as great. Myles Murphy, I would lean more towards a D. I think he does have potential in the future. He did get a few sacks this year. He just didn't really play as much towards the beginning of the season, but these last few weeks he did start to pick it up and get a lot more looks. And I would lean towards the D just because I do think he has that potential.
Yeah, I would argue him up to a C, and it's just the production wasn't what you wanted it to be, but that's because the Bengals do have a lot of good edge rushers already. So maybe I'm not in love with the pick, but I do think Myles Murphy has had some really great plays this year. He's another guy that is just an elite run defender. So when you look at his pass, his QB pressures, obviously his sacks, they're not something that's going to blow you away, but we saw it at Clemson, and I think we're going to see it for the Bengals. He's a guy that can play on the edge and really crash towards the middle and stop defense or stop offensive run attacks. So I like Murphy. I think C is fine. If he goes in the D tier, I'm not going to be angry, but I do think there is a really good player there. Just hasn't been on the field enough to really show it.
Yeah, and I think both of these guys, looking at the next guy, Brian Brzee, too, both of these guys, a little bit comparable, especially when we're looking at the stats too. I think Brzee played a little bit better this season, just looking at the overall stats in the end. But I think both of these guys could easily be kind of on that same tier in the end. But I guess it just depends on how we kind of rank them. Brian Brzee playing more towards the interior of the line this year. So I guess it just depends on where we put both of these guys, but pretty comparable in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. They both, I mean, that's why they worked well at Clemson together, especially earlier in their careers. They do the opposite things really well. I think Brian Brzee can get to a quarterback with a little bit, more fluidity than a guy like Myles Murphy. And he actually has a lot of pressures. I think a lot of those stats were juiced up in that last game they had against Carolina, because that's when Brzee really ate, obviously, against Bryce Young, who, as we mentioned earlier, not really a fully developed decision maker yet. So I don't know. I would vouch that both of these guys are C tier for different reason. Brzee got a lot more run. I think Murphy is going to develop a little bit better going forward. I think he might have a higher ceiling. It is tough because there are some guys in the C tier that we saw more production from this season, but I think late into the first round, taking value, I think both of these teams got it. So I will take a little bit of a flyer on them. I could see the argument another way, but I don't think they did anything to make me think that, they're a D or an F this year.
Yeah, I think fair enough to put them in the C tier, especially looking at the rest of the tiers that we have. With the A plus tier, I think it makes it a little bit more comparable to put them in the C. Next up here, Nolan Smith, one of my favorite players to this draft, just didn't really do much at all this year. Just didn't really get on the field at all either. I mean, looking at his stats in the end, only one sack, only 10 solo tackles. So when we're looking at the production, I think you could make an argument that he was in the F tier just because he didn't really do much this year. But he also just didn't get to play as much too. I mean, looking throughout this season, just didn't get as many snaps on the defense, so he didn't really have as much time to play in the end. But he did get a little bit more time at the end of the season. I do still think he could be a good player, but I could see the production wise putting him in the F tier.
Yeah, and I think we're on the same page here. I'll vouch for the D tier because when he did play, he was all right. Like, I don't think he's a bad player by any means. I don't think he's pushed himself back. I think the Eagles just obviously had a lot of draft capital and they love to draft a lot of defensive players. It was really hard for him to get on the field. And it's tough because the most recent memory of him getting a lot of snaps was when some guys were hurt and they were matched up against the Cowboys. And he had to go up against Tyron Smith, and it wasn't even fair. I mean, Nolan Smith got absolutely dominated. I'll say D, though. He has so much versatility as a player. We saw at Georgia, he was one of the best players on that whole Georgia team pretty much every year he was on it. I mean, he's an incredible player. So I just think when he gets more runs, he'll excel. But I think D tier is fair because his stats do not show that in the slightest.
Yeah, and our final pick here in the first round, we have Felix Uzoma for the Chiefs. I think this guy, towards a little bit towards the bottom, he just didn't get as many stats if we're looking production wise in this year. He is one of the youngest players in this class, though, still only 21 years old. And looking at this Chiefs defense, who has continued to improve year by year, some of their guys who they've drafted in the past few years have got a little bit more run. So on the edge, it is a little bit more competitive right now for the Chiefs, especially after everyone that's come in the past few years. I would lean a little bit more towards the D because I do think he has potential. He is still young, but he just didn't really get to play as much this year that I would hope to see from a guy like him. But I would argue towards the D tier. I don't think that he's a bust. I think he could be, maybe if we don't see as much production next year from him and he doesn't get as much playing time, I think you could argue that. But when we're comparing him to the rest of guys in this F tier, especially towards a guy like Will McDonald, I mean, this guy's 3 years younger. And I think potential wise, you definitely could argue that he could be in the D tier because of that. And I think he is going to be able to go out there and make some plays too if he gets the chance.
Yeah, and for the same reason I argue Nolan Smith in the D tier, I think Uzoma would probably also have to be in the D tier. He's a good player, and I really like what you just mentioned there because I think people are going to originally look at McDonald and Uzoma and say, hey, McDonald was arguably a little bit better, but a 3 year age gap in the NFL where most defensive ends are kind of tapped out by their young 30s, I mean, that's a huge difference. So I like that analysis there. You definitely sold me on it. Yeah, I think Uzoma has a lot of potential. He is stuck behind guys off the edge. I think Karlaftis is a big one. You know, Karlaftis is a guy that was also, as Chiefs players tend to be recently, late first round picks because that's where they end up selecting every year. And Karlaftis, just a little bit better player. I think he's almost going to make an impact soon, just not in his rookie season. It was never really in the cards. So I think D is more than fair.
Yeah, and looking at this now, looking at our original rankings right after the draft, a lot has changed. A lot has kind of stayed the same. When we're looking at the A plus tier, we had three players before with Nolan Smith, Christian Gonzalez, and Jalen Carter. Obviously, Nolan Smith has moved down a lot at this point, just hasn't been able to play as much, which we just talked about. Christian Gonzalez in the C tier didn't get to play as much because he was injured, but definitely has that potential. Jalen Carter staying in that A plus tier. He's been fantastic this year, one of the best players in this draft. Looking at the A tier, we had a few more players before. A lot of the guys that did have a big fall off, though, we're looking at guys like Paris Johnson here, Peter Skoronsky in the B tier. So pretty close. I think he could continue to move up as well. Tyree Wilson just didn't have a great season. Kalijah Cansey, who could make his way back up too, talking about him as well. But there are a lot of guys that kind of surprised us too. Looking at that list, Jahmyr Gibbs, the first guy that I would think of here. Looking in the F tier, we only had Campbell. He's still in the F tier, but now having a few more guys like Quentin Johnston, Emmanuel Forbes, and Will McDonald as well. Bryce Young being in the D tier, just kind of unexpected there. He could rise his way back up, but it's going to be tough, especially looking at how good CJ Stroud's going to be. He's going to be compared to him for the rest of his career just because in the end, it looks like as of right now, they made the wrong decision. How good would CJ Stroud be on the Panthers? We'll never really know, but even a guy like Anthony Richardson, too, maybe could have helped them more.
Yeah. And just to close out this video before we say bye to y'all, I mean, just looking at it, you just mentioned some of the guys that have been the movers. So I'll start off because I'm asking you this question off the top. But who's the guy that you probably were the most impressed with this year and the least impressed with based on your opinions on them going into the draft? I'll start with mine. I mean, I was the most impressed with Jahmyr Gibbs. I talked a lot of smack about him. I did not see him as an elite level running back, and splitting snaps with Montgomery, he was incredible this year. So I got to give him credit. And then it's funny, it made me think of this because my biggest disappointment would have to be the other Lions pick with Jack Campbell. As I mentioned when we talked about him, I love middle linebackers. I think if you get the right one, they're deserving of, top 10 level picks. I think they still hold a very important place in the NFL. And he just got outplayed. I still think he has a lot of potential, but it's just funny looking back on it that Lions draft was so scrutinized, and they have probably the most and the least impressive picks of the first round, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the guy I was most impressed with, I had CJ Stroud as the second best quarterback in this class going into the year, even flirting with the third best behind a guy like Anthony Richardson. But he has come out and played like one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL and has just been fantastic this year. I know a lot of people were big on him even losing last week against the Browns, but this guy has been fantastic. He's come out, and even like I said before at the beginning of this episode, they're kind of playing with house money now against the Ravens. So if they go out there and they somehow shock the world and beat the Ravens, another fantastic end to his rookie year. But even if they lose, I mean, he was the best rookie quarterback that we have ever seen in the NFL. It just seemed like with the receivers that he has, if you go out there and they get maybe a true number one wide receiver that's already developed too, they're going to be very hard to stop in the future. One guy that I'm very disappointed about is Nolan Smith. I thought he was an A+ pick, especially getting him towards the end of the first round. And like we said, he didn't get as much production, but I just wished that he was able to get out there a little bit more. But going from the A+ to the D tier, definitely a disappointment for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, with that being said, we broke down every prospect that was taken in the first round this year. Obviously, this NFL season still in full swing. We're in the playoffs, the divisional rounds, a lot of football left to be played, and we're seeing some guys that slip past the first round have incredible impacts as well. But with that being said, that's going to wrap up our analysis on this video. We appreciate you guys for watching and hope you stick with us towards the end of this NFL season. And as you know, we have our NBA coverage as well. So hope you stick around for that. Peace out, guys.
Yeah. And we'll be back here soon as well with all the draft content too, with the NFL going on. So expect to see a lot more NFL content, especially within the draft within the next few months, especially once the NFL season starts to slow down. And we'll have our pre-draft and post-draft overall rankings of everyone as well. So a lot to look forward to as well in the end.
Yeah, peace out, guys.